We're learning new details about a shooting that left a teenage student dead in Baton Rouge yesterday evening. Welcome to 9 News at 5:30. I'm Liam Combs. EBR Schools says 17-year-old Amari Walker, the victim in a deadly shooting yesterday evening, was a student at Northdale Academy. Baton Rouge police say they found Walker dead yesterday around 5 on Wood Street. A second victim was hurt but is expected to survive. We're told both were seated inside a vehicle in the driveway when the shooting happened. This investigation is ongoing.
At approximately 5 p.m. on January 10th, 2026, in a residential neighborhood on Wood Street in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 17-year-old Amari Walker was shot while sitting in a vehicle in a driveway. According to the Baton Rouge Police Department, gunfire erupted without immediate explanation, leaving Walker fatally wounded at the scene and another person injured and transported to a local hospital. Walker, a student at Northdale Academy, was pronounced dead before detectives could determine motive or suspects. Law enforcement sources confirmed the incident is part of a series of gun violence episodes that unfolded over several days across East Baton Rouge Parish, prompting intensified investigation by homicide and violent crimes units. No arrests have been publicly announced at the time of initial reporting, and key questions remain about the circumstances leading up to the shooting, the identity of the shooters, and potential connections to broader patterns of violence in the city. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to the senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. Amari Walker was a 17-year-old resident of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. At the time of death, Walker lived within East Baton Rouge Parish and was familiar with the Wood Street area, where the fatal shooting later occurred. Walker was a minor and legally dependent on family members, residing in a household that included close relatives who provided daily supervision and support. The home environment was described as structured, with routine school attendance and family involvement. Walker was enrolled in school and attended classes regularly. Educational records indicate consistent enrollment, without any confirmed disciplinary removals at the time of the incident. Teachers and peers described Walker as generally reserved but socially active among a small group of friends. There were no public records indicating expulsion, suspension, or withdrawal from school prior to January 10, 2026. In terms of personality, Walker was described by acquaintances as observant and quiet in larger settings, but communicative among trusted peers. There were no documented behavioral issues requiring law enforcement or juvenile intervention. Walker maintained friendships primarily with individuals of similar age within the same community. Walker's interests included spending time with friends, listening to music, and using social media platforms to communicate. There is no public indication that Walker was involved in organized groups or criminal activity. Online activity consisted mainly of direct messaging and social interaction rather than public posting. Investigators reviewed digital communications to determine whether recent disputes or threats existed, though no confirmed motive was established during early stages of the investigation. No major life transitions were publicly reported in the weeks before the shooting. However, investigators considered the broader environment Walker was living in, including exposure to neighborhood crime and the possibility of indirect involvement in disputes affecting others within Walker's social circle. There was no confirmed history of Walker being previously shot or arrested, but like many residents in parts of Baton Rouge, Walker lived in proximity to recurring incidents of gun violence. Wood Street is located within a residential area of Baton Rouge, consisting primarily of single-family homes and driveways set close to the roadway. The neighborhood includes long-term residents, rental properties, and areas with limited lighting. Vehicular traffic is moderate, and pedestrian activity varies depending on time of day. During early 2026, East Baton Rouge Parish experienced multiple violent incidents involving firearms. Law enforcement agencies had acknowledged an increase in shootings, particularly involving young individuals, some occurring in residential zones rather than commercial districts. Several incidents reported in the days and weeks surrounding January 10th were under separate investigations. Community police relations at the time were strained but functional. Residents frequently expressed concern about response times and unsolved cases, while police departments emphasized ongoing investigations and reliance on community cooperation. Witness reluctance remained a known challenge, especially in cases involving retaliatory violence. Surveillance availability in the Wood Street area was inconsistent. Some homes had private cameras, while others did not. There were no confirmed city-owned cameras positioned directly at the driveway where the shooting occurred. Detectives canvassed the area to identify any recording devices that may have captured vehicle movement or individuals before or after the incident. On January 10th, 2026, Walker's movements earlier in the day were consistent with routine weekend activity. Walker was known to have left home and spent time with acquaintances. There was no indication of planned travel outside Baton Rouge or attendance at a scheduled event later that day. By the afternoon, Walker was inside a vehicle parked in a driveway on Wood Street. The reason for being at that specific location was under investigation, though it was believed Walker was visiting or accompanying someone known to the household. Shortly after 5 p.m., residents in the area reported hearing multiple gunshots. Emergency calls were placed within minutes, with callers reporting gunfire and a vehicle in a driveway with occupants inside. Dispatch logs recorded the incident as a shooting with possible injuries. Police units and emergency medical services were dispatched immediately. Officers arrived first, followed closely by medical responders. The scene was secured upon arrival due to the presence of victims and potential ongoing danger. The vehicle was parked stationary in a residential driveway at the time of the shooting. Walker was seated inside the vehicle along with at least one other individual. The seating arrangement placed Walker in a position exposed to gunfire from outside the vehicle. Investigators determined that shots were fired from outside the vehicle, though the exact direction and shooter position required further forensic analysis. Shell casings were recovered at the scene, suggesting multiple rounds were discharged. The estimated number of shots was based on physical evidence rather than witness estimates, as auditory recollections varied. The vehicle sustained visible damage, including bullet entry points and shattered glass. Blood evidence was present inside the vehicle, indicating the injuries occurred while the victims remained seated. Immediately following the shooting, witnesses reported observing the vehicle stationary and individuals inside unresponsive. No confirmed description of a suspect fleeing the scene was publicly released in the initial stages. Residents did not attempt to intervene physically, but contacted emergency services. Some witnesses remained nearby to provide statements when officers arrived. First responders arrived within minutes of the initial emergency calls. Officers secured the perimeter to prevent contamination of evidence and ensure scene safety. Emergency medical personnel assessed both victims inside the vehicle. Walker was found to be unresponsive with multiple gunshot wounds. After evaluation, medical personnel determined Walker had no signs of life. Walker was pronounced deceased at the scene, consistent with standard protocol when resuscitation is deemed unsuccessful.
We're learning new details about a shooting that left a teenage student dead in Baton Rouge yesterday evening. Welcome to 9 News at 5:30. I'm Liam Combs. EBR Schools says 17-year-old Amari Walker, the victim in a deadly shooting yesterday evening, was a student at Northdale Academy. Baton Rouge police say they found Walker dead yesterday around 5 on Wood Street. A second victim was hurt but is expected to survive. We're told both were seated inside a vehicle in the driveway when the shooting happened. This investigation is ongoing. EBR School Superintendent Lamont Cole responding to the violence, saying in part, quote, "We are heartbroken by the senseless violence that took the life of Amari Walker, a student at Northdale Academy. We remain committed to supporting our students, honoring Amari's life, and continuing to work with the community partners to address violence and ensure our schools are places of safety, care, and hope." Cole says iCare, an organization focusing on youth counseling and trauma intervention, will be on campus to meet with any students who may be struggling in the wake of this loss.
The second victim was conscious and transported to a local hospital for treatment. Injuries were later described as non-life-threatening. Following medical response, police expanded the crime scene boundaries. The driveway, vehicle, and surrounding area were taped off. Investigators began evidence collection, including shell casings, vehicle examination, and documentation of the scene. The scene remained secured for several hours as detectives worked to reconstruct the incident. No immediate arrests were made, and the case was transferred to homicide investigators for further review. When responding officers secured the scene on Wood Street, the area surrounding the vehicle was immediately treated as a homicide scene. Yellow tape was placed to restrict access, and patrol units maintained perimeter while detectives began documenting physical evidence. The primary focus was a vehicle in which Emurai Walker was seated at the time of the shooting. Investigators identified multiple shell casings scattered on the pavement near the driveway and roadway, suggesting that several rounds had been fired in rapid succession. Each casing was photographed in place, marked, and collected for later ballistic analysis. Bloodstain patterns were carefully documented both inside and outside the vehicle. Detectives photographed visible blood pooling on the seat and floorboard, as well as smaller transfer stains on the door panel and exterior frame. These patterns were analyzed to help determine the position of the victim at the time of the shooting and whether any movement occurred after the shots were fired. Investigators also assessed whether the blood evidence indicated shots fired from outside the vehicle or from close proximity. The vehicle itself was examined for bullet strikes, shattered glass, and entry and exit points. Investigators measured the angle of each impact to assist in reconstructing the shooter's position. After on-scene documentation was completed, the vehicle was towed to a secure facility for further forensic testing, including trace evidence collection and gunshot residue analysis. Forensic photography teams captured wide-angle and close-up images of the entire scene, including the driveway, nearby residences, street layout, and lighting conditions. Measurements were taken to map distances between shell casings, the vehicle, and surrounding structures. Based on the initial evidence, investigators began forming early working theories, including whether the shooter approached on foot or fired from another vehicle, and whether the shooting was targeted or opportunistic. Detectives canvassed a neighborhood within hours of the shooting, speaking with residents who reported hearing gunshots. Several neighbors stated they heard multiple rapid pops, consistent with semi-automatic gunfire, followed by the sound of a vehicle accelerating away from the area. The timing of these reports helped investigators narrow the estimated time of the shooting. Some individuals reported seeing movement near the driveway shortly before the gunfire, though descriptions varied. A few witnesses believed they saw a person running from the scene, while others reported a vehicle leaving at a high rate of speed. These accounts were documented, but inconsistencies in descriptions made it difficult to establish a definitive suspect profile. Investigators noted contradictions between statements regarding the direction of flight and the number of people involved. Some witnesses recalled one individual, while others believed multiple people may have been present. These inconsistencies required detectives to carefully cross-reference timelines and physical evidence to determine which accounts aligned most closely with the forensic findings. Cooperation from witnesses was limited in some cases. Several residents declined to provide formal statements, citing concerns about personal safety. Detectives acknowledged the possibility that fear of retaliation played a role in the reluctance of some witnesses to come forward. As a result, investigators relied heavily on physical evidence, surveillance footage from nearby homes, and anonymous tips to supplement witness testimony. As part of the investigation, detectives conducted a detailed victimology analysis to determine whether Emurai Walker was specifically targeted. This process involved reviewing Walker's daily routines, recent activities, and known associations. Investigators examined whether the shooting appeared planned or whether Walker was present during a broader act of violence. Personal relationships were closely reviewed, including friendships, family connections, and recent interpersonal interactions. Detectives interviewed individuals who had contact with Walker in the days leading up to the shooting to identify any potential conflicts or disputes. No immediate evidence of an ongoing feud was publicly confirmed during the early stages of the investigation. Investigators also examined recent social media activity to determine whether any threats, arguments, or references to conflict were present. Posts, messages, and tagged interactions were reviewed for indicators of escalating tension or warnings of violence. This review included assessing whether Walker had been involved in disputes online that could have translated into real-world confrontations. The possibility of mistaken identity was also considered. Detectives evaluated whether Walker may have been confused with another individual or whether the second victim in the vehicle was the intended target. The positioning of the occupants and the distribution of bullet impacts were analyzed to assess this theory. At this stage, investigators did not rule out any scenario. Based on the available evidence, investigators explored multiple suspect and motive theories. One line of inquiry focused on the possibility of a targeted attack. The number of shots fired and the concentration of bullet impacts suggested the shooter may have intended to seriously harm one or both occupants of the vehicle. Another theory considered the possibility of random gunfire or an opportunistic act of violence. Detectives examined whether the shooting could have been a result of an unrelated dispute occurring nearby or a spontaneous confrontation that escalated rapidly. Retaliation or interpersonal conflict was also evaluated. Investigators reviewed whether the shooting could be connected to a prior altercation involving Walker or individuals within their social circle. This included examining recent disagreements, confrontations, or unresolved disputes. Gang or group-related violence was assessed due to the broader pattern of gun violence in the area. Detectives analyzed whether the shooting matched characteristics of other incidents involving group activity, including weapon type, number of shots fired, and location selection. At the same time, investigators cautioned against drawing conclusions without corroborating evidence. A key question remained whether the second victim was the intended target. The seating positions, injury patterns, and bullet trajectories were reviewed to determine whether Walker was struck incidentally or deliberately. This theory remained under active review as forensic results were processed. The autopsy conducted by the coroner's office confirmed the cause of death as multiple gunshot wounds. The report documented entry and exit wounds, internal injuries, and the fatal trajectory of at least one projectile. This information was critical in determining the sequence of shots and the shooter's position relative to the vehicle. Bullet trajectory analysis was performed using measurements from the vehicle and scene. Investigators assessed the angles of impact to determine whether the shots were fired from street level, an elevated position, or another vehicle. These findings help refine the reconstruction of the shooting. Determining the firing distance was another key component. Gunshot residue patterns and wound characteristics were analyzed to estimate how far the shooter was from the victim. Results suggested the shots were fired from outside the vehicle, though the exact distance remained under evaluation. Ballistics testing was conducted on the recovered shell casings to identify the firearm type and caliber. The casings were entered into a national database to determine whether the weapon had been used in other shootings. Investigators compared the evidence against unsolved cases in the region to identify potential links. As forensic results continued to develop, detectives integrated the findings with witness statements and digital evidence. Each result either supported or eliminated specific theories, gradually narrowing the scope of the investigation, while leaving critical questions unresolved. Following the fatal shooting of Emery Walker, the Baton Rouge Police Department formally assigned the case to its Homicide Division. Experienced detectives specializing in violent crimes assumed responsibility for coordinating the investigation, managing evidence, and pursuing all available leads. The case was treated as a priority due to the age of the victim and the public location of the shooting. One of the first strategic actions taken by investigators was a comprehensive review of surveillance footage. Detectives canvassed the Wood Street area and surrounding blocks, identifying homes, apartment complexes, and nearby businesses equipped with exterior security cameras. Officers requested voluntary access to footage covering the hours before, during, and after the shooting. This review focused on identifying vehicles passing through the area, individuals on foot, and any activity consistent with a suspect fleeing the scene. In some cases, footage was incomplete, unavailable, or overwritten due to short data retention periods, limiting its usefulness. In parallel, investigators conducted cell phone data analysis. This included reviewing the phone records of the victims to reconstruct their movements and communications leading up to the incident. Detectives examined recent calls, text messages, and app usage to identify potential conflicts, meetings, or threats. Geolocation data was also analyzed to confirm timelines and establish whether additional individuals were present nearby at the time of the shooting. When potential persons of interest emerged, legal requests were prepared to obtain relevant phone data for comparison. Anonymous tips became another critical component of the investigative strategy. Law enforcement encouraged members of the public to share information through confidential tip lines. Officers emphasized anonymity to reduce fear of retaliation, a common barrier in gun violence investigations. Tips received varied in quality and specificity, requiring careful verification before being incorporated into the case file. Public outreach was conducted through brief official statements, confirming basic facts without compromising the investigation. This approach aimed to balance transparency with the need to protect sensitive information. Despite these efforts, detectives faced several obstacles. These included uncooperative witnesses, limited physical evidence, conflicting statements, and the absence of clear motive. Fear within the community further complicated efforts, as some individuals were reluctant to engage with law enforcement. Law enforcement followed standard protocol in notifying Walker's next of kin. Officers delivered the notification in person, providing verified information regarding the death and outlining the investigative process that would follow. Family members were informed of available support services and provided with a point of contact within the department. The immediate family response involved coordination with authorities regarding identification procedures and the release of the body. Family members were briefed on what information could be shared publicly and what details would remain restricted due to the ongoing investigation. Communication between the family and detectives continued as investigators sought background information that might assist in identifying potential leads. Funeral arrangements and memorial services were organized by the family within days of the incident. These events were attended by relatives, peers, and members of the community. Law enforcement maintained a limited presence to ensure safety and manage any potential disruptions, given the circumstances of the death. The long-term impact on the family extended beyond the initial loss. Financial challenges arose related to funeral expenses and the loss of future support Walker might have provided. Family members adjusted to new responsibilities and disruptions to daily routines. In some cases, relatives sought counseling or legal guidance as they navigated the aftermath. Throughout the investigation, the family cooperated with law enforcement by answering questions, providing access to personal records when requested, and participating in follow-up interviews. While they were not given access to all investigative details, detectives maintained periodic contact to share general updates and reinforce that the case remained active. Walker's death had an immediate effect on the school community. Administrators were notified by law enforcement and worked quickly to inform staff and students using established crisis response protocols. Classes continued, but additional supervision and monitoring were implemented to maintain order and safety. Counseling services were made available to students who knew Walker personally or were affected by the incident. School counselors and external mental health professionals offered individual and group sessions, focusing on providing structure and coping strategies. Attendance fluctuated in the days following the shooting, reflecting the broader impact on the student body. School administrators also initiated internal discussions regarding safety procedures. These discussions included evaluating campus security measures, reviewing emergency response plans, and coordinating with local law enforcement on preventive strategies. While no direct threat to the school was identified, the incident prompted renewed attention to student safety beyond school grounds. The case contributed to broader concerns about youth gun violence within the community. Educators, parents, and local officials discussed the frequency of firearm-related incidents involving minors and the challenges of prevention. These discussions emphasized early intervention, conflict resolution education, and community-based programs aimed at reducing youth exposure to violence. Media coverage began shortly after the shooting, with local outlets reporting confirmed details, such as the location, time, and age of the victim. Initial reports relied heavily on information provided by law enforcement, with limited context due to the early stage of the investigation. As coverage expanded, media organizations faced decisions regarding what information to release versus what to withhold. Authorities requested discretion regarding specific evidence, suspect descriptions, and investigative strategies. As a result, official updates were often brief and infrequent, leading to gaps in publicly available information. Public speculation filled these gaps, particularly on social media platforms. Unverified claims, rumors, and assumptions circulated, some of which conflicted with known facts. Law enforcement addressed misinformation selectively, correcting only statements that pose a risk to the investigation or public safety. Media pressure increased over time as the case remained unresolved. Journalists sought updates, interviews, and confirmation of potential leads. Law enforcement balanced these requests with the need to preserve the integrity of the investigation, reiterating that certain details could not be disclosed until charges were filed or arrests made. In the weeks following the shooting, investigators continued to process evidence and follow up on leads. Surveillance footage was reanalyzed as new information emerged, and additional witnesses were re-interviewed to clarify inconsistencies. Tips continued to arrive, though many lacked sufficient detail to advance the case. At various points, persons of interest were identified based on circumstantial evidence, witness statements, or digital data. These individuals were interviewed, and their alibis were examined. In some instances, individuals were ruled out after verification. In others, inquiries remained ongoing. Search warrants were considered and, where legally justified, executed to obtain digital records, physical evidence, or additional surveillance material. Each warrant required probable cause supported by collected evidence, contributing to the measured pace of the investigation. As time passed, the case experienced periods of reduced activity, often described as stagnation. This typically occurred while awaiting forensic results or the emergence of new leads. Investigators periodically reassessed the case file, identifying areas requiring renewed focus. When new information surfaced, investigative efforts intensified accordingly. At the time reflected in this outline, the case remained open. Law enforcement continued to pursue accountability, emphasizing that unresolved cases are subject to ongoing review and that new evidence can alter the direction of an investigation at any stage. Following the fatal shooting of 17-year-old Emery Walker on January 10, 2026, the case was formally classified as a homicide and assigned to the appropriate investigative and prosecutorial units. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement focused on evidence collection, witness interviews, and forensic testing before any formal charges could be considered. As with many active homicide investigations involving juveniles in public locations, authorities exercise caution in releasing details to avoid compromising potential prosecutions. At the time of early case updates, no arrests were publicly announced, and no suspect was formally charged. Prosecutors typically require a combination of physical evidence, credible witness testimony, and corroborating forensic results before authorizing charges. In cases involving drive-by or targeted shootings, delays are often attributed to the need for ballistic confirmation, digital evidence review, and verification of witness statements. Court proceedings, if initiated, will begin with the filing of formal charges such as second-degree murder or manslaughter, depending on the evidence supporting intent and circumstances. Preliminary hearings would determine whether sufficient probable cause existed to proceed to trial. Procedural delays are common at this stage, especially if key witnesses are unavailable, evidence analysis is ongoing, or defense counsel requests continuances to review discovery materials. The prosecution's position will rely heavily on forensic evidence, including ballistic matches, gunshot trajectory analysis, and autopsy findings. Witness testimony, including that of the surviving victim and any nearby residents, will be evaluated for consistency and credibility. Digital evidence, such as phone records or surveillance footage, would be used to establish timelines and potential suspect movements. The defense, if a suspect were charged, would likely challenge the reliability of eyewitness accounts, question forensic conclusions, and scrutinize investigative procedures. Defense strategies in such cases often focus on reasonable doubt, alternative suspects, or the absence of direct physical evidence linking the accused to the weapon used. Depending on the strength of the evidence, plea negotiations could be pursued to avoid trial, particularly if the accused faced substantial sentencing exposure. If no plea agreement were reached, the case would proceed to trial, where evidence would be presented before a jury. As of the most recent publicly known status, the case remained unresolved, with no confirmed trial outcome available. Despite investigative efforts, several critical questions remain central to the case. The most fundamental issue is the identity of the individual or individuals who fired the shots. Without a confirmed suspect, determining responsibility remains a primary challenge for investigators. Another unresolved issue is motive. Authorities have not publicly confirmed whether the shooting was targeted, retaliatory, or random. Investigators continue to assess whether Walker or the second victim was the intended target, or whether the shooting resulted from a broader dispute unrelated to the victim's immediate actions. It also remains unclear whether all individuals involved in the events leading up to the shooting have been identified. In many cases, witnesses may withhold information due to fear of retaliation or distrust of law enforcement, limiting the scope of available testimony. Questions also persist regarding evidence that may not yet have been fully analyzed or disclosed. This includes potential surveillance footage from nearby residences, untested ballistic evidence, digital communications, and anonymous tips that require verification. Investigators must determine whether any critical evidence remains unexamined or whether new leads could emerge with renewed public cooperation. The death of Emirai Walker reflects broader concerns surrounding youth exposure to firearms and gun violence in urban communities. The case highlights how minors can become victims in environments where access to weapons and unresolved conflicts intersect. This incident also underscores gaps in violence prevention strategies, particularly those aimed at early intervention, youth conflict resolution, and community-based safety initiatives. While law enforcement responds after crimes occur, preventative measures often rely on resources that may be limited or inconsistently applied. Community trust in law enforcement is another significant factor. Cooperation from witnesses is essential in homicide investigations, yet reluctance to come forward can impede progress. This case illustrates the impact that strained relationships between communities and authorities can have on achieving accountability. On a systemic level, the case reflects recurring patterns seen in youth gun violence: delayed resolutions, limited public information, and prolonged uncertainty for families and neighborhoods. These patterns raise questions about resource allocation, investigative capacity, and long-term solutions to prevent similar incidents. As of the latest available information, the case surrounding the death of Emirai Walker remains open or unresolved, with no publicly confirmed arrest or conviction. Law enforcement continues to classify the investigation as active, indicating that efforts to identify those responsible are ongoing. The impact on Walker's family and neighborhood has been substantial, affecting daily routines, perceptions of safety, and long-term stability. Memorials and private remembrances have taken place, while the broader community remains attentive to developments in the case. Authorities continue to request information from the public, emphasizing that even small details could contribute to progress. Anonymous reporting channels remain available to encourage cooperation without fear of reprisal. Ultimately, this case represents more than a single incident. It stands as an example of the persistent challenges posed by gun violence involving young victims, unresolved investigations, and systemic limitations. While known facts establish the time, location, and outcome of the shooting, unanswered questions continue to define the case. Until accountability is achieved, the death of Emirai Walker remains part of a larger narrative concerning violence, prevention, and justice in the community. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining